Hey 3B, it's time for the conclusion of a dog's porpoise. When we left the story last night, they were working on a plan to try to lure Banger out into the harbor with some of the other ships that had been docked there, and something was not going according to Natalie's plan. "Stop!" Natalie cried. "Dad, tell them to stop!" But the Sammy boy, Mr. Reardon's boat, was already trundling out from under the drawbridge, and Banger was already tearing toward the open water frantically, taking a blind stab at escape. "He's making it out," someone pointed out over the radio. "That's good, right?" "That's even worse," Natalie said, clearing the deck in 2 strides and snatching the radio from her father's hand. "What if he goes out there all confused and we lose him? We're not going to get a second chance at this," she wanted to yell, but Mr. Grundy, who was just 2 boats over from them on the Kelly Natasha, was already cutting in. "He's going to pass our boat any moment." "Stop all the boats," Natalie yelled. "Tell them all to stop." Cut your engines, Mr. Prater said as he looked out at the drawbridge, where a dozen boats were now well out into the cove. When he turned back to his daughter, his eyes were wide. "I don't think they're listening, Natalie." Well, Natalie thought, if they aren't going to respond to any of the signals they all agreed to, I'll just have to come up with a new one. "Hold on to Lars," Natalie said, picking up the leash she'd dropped to the deck. She placed it in her father's hand before making her way rapidly to the edge of the boat. "What's your plan?" "Natalie Prater, you stop this instant. Everybody, cut your engines!" But Natalie didn't have time to stop, and she had no idea if anyone did cut their engines just then, because she was too busy jumping off the boat. Splash! Just like Lars had done all those nights ago, Natalie plunged into the ocean, and for a split second, the sound of her father roaring into his radio was muffled by water and the rush of air bubbles. Then her life jacket yanked her back up, even as momentum carried her body down, and Natalie breached the surface, feeling like gravity had just tried to tear her body in two. As salt water stung her nostrils and eyes, she gasped and coughed and tried to get a sense of her surroundings. The first thing she noticed was the unexpected quiet of the cove, as all of the boats surrounding her suddenly stopped. The fishermen gazed down at Natalie from their boats, amazed by the crazy girl who had jumped into the water. The second thing Natalie noticed was Lars, barking bloody murder just a few yards behind her. And the third thing she noticed was Banger, missing Natalie by mere inches as he shot straight past her and made his way out into the open water. There wasn't time for Natalie to think. She could only try to get Banger's attention using the first method that sprang to mind. She put 2 fingers in her mouth and whistled as loud as she possibly could. The whistle went on for as long as her wave-battered lungs could manage, and when it was done, an eerie silence fell over the cove. All the boats were stationary. Lars, perhaps impressed by Natalie's approximation of a dog whistle, had ceased his barking for at least the current moment, and from out past the Maria P., though Natalie strained her ears to hear, there was nothing at all, no sign that any of this had worked. And then, puff! The sound wasn't far away. Natalie's head was well above water, but she still gasped and held her breath. Puff! And that one was closer still. Natalie exhaled. Banger was coming back. A cheer went up among the men before Mr. Prater hissed into his radio. "Don't scare him, guys. Be quiet." But it was like Banger had fixed onto a homing beacon, and that beacon was Natalie. Soon she could make out his silver shape pushing past the bottom of the Maria P., and then circling her in wide arcs that drew even tighter, until finally, miraculously, he was right in front of her. Banger poked his head out of the water and eyed her warily. Natalie almost laughed with delight, but she was as nervous about spooking Banger as her father was. Slowly and carefully she reached out her hands, palms up, before turning them over to rest on Banger's melon. "Hey," she said softly. Banger released a shrill whistle. Over his dorsal fin, Natalie saw Lars's ears perk up, and he pulled at his leash, though Mr. Prater held on tight. "I'm sorry we scared you," Natalie said, still speaking in gentle and measured tones. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. We thought you would follow us out first, and then everyone else could bring up the rear, so you would get that we were all going somewhere, so that you'd feel like we were going together." She tried to nod her head out toward the open water. Banger puffed again and then ducked below the surface of the waves. Natalie fell forward a little, losing the balance she'd had on Banger's head, though her life jacket righted her swiftly. When Banger emerged again, he was a few feet farther away. He whistled again. "Hey," Natalie heard her father say. "Cut it out, Lars." Natalie kept her eyes on Banger. "You don't understand, do you?" she said sadly. "I get it. You're scared out of your mind, and you're an animal and one who doesn't like change. I know how that feels." But she didn't know what that could possibly be like. She felt like she'd tried everything. Meanwhile, the fussing from the boat was getting louder. "I'm serious," Mr. Prater said. "Stop yanking. You're giving my hand rope burn. Hey, ow, hey!" And then there was a single bark and a yelp and a skittering of paws and claws against the surface of the deck, and then splash. And as Natalie and Banger both turned around to see what was going on, Natalie felt her heart rise at an unexpected thought. Maybe, she realized, she hadn't tried everything. Chapter 18. Lars. For the record, Lars had thought this was a pretty silly plan from the get-go. To be fair, there were some parts of it he didn't understand. Even after he'd heard Diver Bob and everyone else explain it at the big town meeting, he'd still been unclear as to why exactly they had to make Banger leave town. He got it that it had something to do with the summer temperature, but Lars wasn't crazy about heat either. And did he go north every time the summer rolled around? No, he just shed his winter fur like a normal animal. Couldn't Banger do that? Apparently not. Maybe it was a porpoise thing. But then there were parts of the plan that he felt like he did understand, that the humans did not. Like all the noise. Lars could have told anyone, had they bothered to ask him, that starting up an entire town's worth of boats without warning was going to be way more scary than reassuring for Banger. He wanted Banger to hear a friendly sound, rather than the incoming onslaught of Ogunquit's engines. But clearly it hadn't worked. The porpoise couldn't understand the dog, the humans couldn't understand the porpoise, and Lars felt like he could understand everyone, but he couldn't make anyone listen. Even now, watching Natalie and Banger meet in the water, Lars whimpered in sympathy every time Banger released one of his high-pitched whistles. He strained at his collar, but Mr. Prater just pulled tighter on his leash. Lars didn't blame him for being tense. The man was clearly uncomfortable, already having one of his passengers out in the water. Natalie was trying to help, but whatever she was saying to Banger just wasn't getting through. It hurt for Lars to watch two people he loved fail to understand each other, just as it had hurt to watch Natalie not realize how much her mother still loved her, the same way it had hurt Mr. Prater when he kicked Lars off the porch. Lars understood why all those mistakes had happened. Humans thought they could solve all their problems by thinking about them and talking about them. But as a dog, Lars knew it didn't work like that. The best way to make people feel better was to show them they were cared for, in a way they couldn't miss. Even when people were confused or upset, some actions could be understood in any language. And in that moment, Lars finally understood what he had to do. "Sorry about this, Mr. Prater," Lars thought, yanking on his leash. Lars pulled harder and harder until finally Mr. Prater released the leash and Lars dashed madly across the deck. Behind him, he heard Mr. Prater try to grab at the leash, but Lars was already catapulting himself up and off the deck. Splash! As the world went dark around him, Lars remembered how it had felt the first time he went over the edge of the Maria P. It was scary to think about, especially as he paddled furiously up toward the surface. But what was happening now didn't seem half as scary to Lars. After all, this wasn't some accidental fall. The moment he got back above water, Lars spun this way and that, finding what he was looking for. Natalie, staring at him in shock, and Banger a few feet away. Over the past couple of weeks, Lars had become extremely good at doggy paddling, but Banger still helped him out by closing some of the distance between them. Soon they were close enough to touch, and even though he knew he'd get a snoutful of salt water for his troubles, Lars did for Banger what he'd done for Natalie just that morning. He gave the porpoise a big lick across the beak. In response, Banger rocked this way and that before emitting a warbling whistle, one that was music to Lars' ears. Gone were all the frightened frequencies of stress and confusion. Hoping that his plan would work better than the human's plan, Lars looked Banger in the eyes one more time and then put his head down and swam straight into Banger's side. Thump! But Lars had absolutely meant to bang into him, and now he intended to do it again. Thump! He swam right into Banger's side and then retreated a few more feet. After one or more repetitions, Banger looked back in the direction Lars was pushing him, towards the Maria P. Ruff! Lars barked. Now you're getting it. Tentatively, Banger swam a few feet toward the boat. Lars wagged his tail hard enough to stir the water around him. The night they'd met, Banger had saved Lars' life. Now Lars would return the favor. Natalie must have caught on at that point, because now Lars could feel her swimming past him, making her way to the boat. Get ready to go, Dad, and make sure everyone else is ready to go too. But this time, they can only turn their boats on one at a time. Lars no longer had to physically push Banger to get him to go where he wanted. In fact, Banger helped nudge Lars around the side of the Maria P, and then the two friends were out in the open water. Banger, wait! Natalie cried. But as Lars slowed down, his plan took hold. Banger, realizing his friend was no longer there, turned to look back, and he saw Lars and the Maria P and all the boats lined up. And in that moment, even though they were a few hundred feet apart, and Lars didn't speak porpoise and Banger didn't speak dog. Despite all that, Lars felt like they understood each other. No longer worried that Banger would swim off unaccompanied, Lars turned around and proudly paddled back to the side of the Maria P. Well, Mr. Prater said, let's get that dog back on board. We've got a porpoise to guide. Banger had to admit, once Lars had coached him on it, and once Banger had stopped questioning it, and once the boats of Perkins Cove had given him enough distance, having someone else do your echolocation was a pretty sweet deal. He didn't know how long they were doing it. He'd never known that humans even could do it. But the farther upshore they went, the clearer it became. At first, Banger hadn't totally understood. Since Lars had pushed him out to sea, Banger didn't feel threatened, but close enough that the message was clear. No, not this way, go another way. So he changed tack and chose a direction, and as soon as he went too far in that direction, another pod of boats pulled up alongside him as if to say, Whoa, you overcorrected. Try for something in the middle. Now, Banger understood why Natalie had had so many boats. There was a whole lot of ocean out there for Banger to get lost in. and people wanted to keep him going in the right direction. Home. They were taking him home. The moment he realized this, a thrill shot through his body. It was incredible. It felt like swimming with an entire tidal wave of power. And there was the Maria P. working hard to stay alongside Banger. Around hour 4, Banger noticed that certain boats were beginning to peel off from the group. The fewer boats there were, the quieter it was. And he did feel a pang of envy for those humans who could just go home at the drop of a hat. For him, going home was shaping up to be a grueling odyssey. By hour 6, Banger wasn't sure he could go on anymore. He tried to puff out a signal to Natalie or Lars, but what could possibly lie ahead of him that was worth all the trouble? Focusing his senses, Banger released the strongest blast of echolocation he could muster up, straining to get as good a view of what was coming up as possible. Just then, the clicks he'd sent out returned to him, mapping the sound of the ocean. There were some seagulls, there were some mackerel swimming, and there, sneaking up on the mackerel, was a large and round figure, a slowly moving sphere of a porpoise? It couldn't be. Banger clicked again, this time pushing even farther than the reach of his last. But sure enough, beyond the large and slow porpoise was another porpoise, and beyond that, a porpoise whose shape looked a lot like Banger's, only slightly bigger and slightly older. His pod. It was Banger's family. But the shapes in his vision didn't seem to notice. If anything, they seemed to be swimming farther. No doubt they'd been spooked by the sound of the engines that accompanied Banger. Woof! There was Lars. Woof! Woof! Dad! Banger heard Natalie yell. Stop the boat! Everyone, stop the boat! Banger had already swum a long distance, and the thought of swimming any farther made him ache all over. He didn't want any of their hard work to go to waste, and he wanted nothing more than for his 2 favorite families to meet, to tell Kittery all about his adventures with the fur turtle, and to introduce his little sister Bristol to his new friend Natalie. So he did swim farther. Banger repeated, a little more weakly, now that he was once more almost out of breath. As Kittery returned the call, everyone else in the pod did too. Bristol was too out of her mind hyper to say much of anything coherent, zipping and circling all around them, like one of those darting fish Uncle York was always looking for. Their love re-energized Banger, and by the time everyone had gotten their share of spinning and dipping, he was ready to share with them all the things he'd been hoping to share with them. It was the best day Banger could ever remember, and porpoises tended to have some pretty good days. As for Lars, he was in and out of the water constantly, splashing and being splashed in turn by one porpoise after another, but by Banger most of all. The sun was going down, and there weren't many onlookers left. Most of the fishermen had gone home by now, and now there were only a few handful of boats remaining. Banger, Natalie said, we have to go now. And just like that, he knew how to say goodbye. He announced to his family, watch this. He swam cautiously up to Lars, nudging him, and before Lars could react, Banger dipped underwater briefly, just long enough to position himself, and he rose, and Lars rose with him, adjusting his stance until he had a good perch on Banger's back. Banger had decided to say goodbye the exact same way he'd said hello, and that was better than any goodbye. Chapter 20. I still think it's a bad idea. It's a great idea. He'll do great. He sees one tennis ball or one croissant and he'll be gone like a shot, and the whole thing will be ruined. Who brings a tennis ball to a wedding? I wouldn't rule you out for starters. Oh no, he heard you say tennis balls. Lars leaped up hopefully at Natalie, assuming a tennis ball was about to be thrown, and the pillow that had been carefully balanced on his back went flying. See, Mr. Prater said, if there had been a ring on that, it'd be totally gone by now. We've still got some time, Natalie said. Besides, who else would you pick to be the ring bearer? Sammy Reardon? No way. He's even more distractible than Lars. You've got one day, Mr. Prater said. I just don't want to be known as the man who ruined his ex-wife's wedding because he allowed a dog to... Hello, a woman said, poking her head in the door. I wanted to show you I got my suit dry cleaned. The Praters, Natalie, her father, and Lars followed Natalie's mom out of the back room of Barry's Barnacle Seafood Restaurant. It's not the classiest place in the world, Natalie's mother admitted, but it makes Bob happy, and that's what makes me happy. It was clearly making Lars happy, too. I can't believe you're going to be in the wedding, Mr. Prater muttered to Lars as they sat down for dinner. You asked for it when you adopted him, Nancy Jane said. Isn't that right, Mark? As a public official, I can offer no comment, said the mayor, sitting next to Mary Jane and blushing. It had been an odd summer. It had also been the best summer of Natalie's life. The Maria P could be made... And Natalie's life hadn't been too rough either. She'd made quite a bit of money that summer babysitting, and fame had come with its own set of benefits for her. She'd never exactly been unpopular at school, but being the girl in the news with the porpoise-riding dog still opened up all sorts of new social windows. When a few girls from the swim team asked for her autograph, she'd struck up a conversation with them, and they quickly became friends. And now here they all were, just past the dying days of tourist season, preparing for what looked to be a beautiful October wedding. Lars sat under the table on a beautiful October day, gnawing on a chunk of lobster. Everything was perfect, or almost perfect. Every time Natalie saw a reminder of Bangor, she felt a stab of loss and curiosity. Her thoughts, not to mention the entire rehearsal dinner, were interrupted by an unexpected and violent knocking on the door of Barnacle Berry's. What in the world? Natalie's mother said. Sam Reardon, Natalie said. What could possibly be so important? He's back, he's back, he's back, he's back, Sam was yelling, jumping up and down in great hops. Natalie's jaw dropped. You don't think... Go, Nancy said. Go. Natalie turned around and saw that Sam was already running toward the beach. Come on, Lars, she said, and she followed Sam out the door. Mrs. Reardon, what's going on? Natalie interrupted breathlessly. She was almost certain she knew the answer, but she wanted to hear it for herself. Natalie heard exactly the answer she was looking for. Puff. Natalie whirled. Sam jumped up and down and yelled incomprehensibly. Lars did the same, but in dog language. And there, in the chilly October waters of Perkins Cove, was Bangor, smiling cheekily at Natalie, just waiting for someone to come in and play with him. Wait, no, there was already someone, or some things, in there with him. Puff, puff. It's his family, Natalie said. He brought his whole pod. There was a little porpoise zooming around curiously, two larger porpoises hanging back, but clearly intrigued by the mass of humanity on the beach, and the largest, laziest porpoise Natalie had ever seen. But before she could process any of that, or decide what to do next, Lars decided for everyone. He ran straight down the beach, raced over the surf, and splashed hard and fast into the water. And as she followed Lars into the water, completely soaking her new dress, Natalie felt like, at long last, every member of her family was together. It was a big family, and an odd one, and sometimes she didn't see people in it for a while, and sometimes the people in her family weren't even people. but they were all hers, and she loved them. They were her good thing, and she jumped in. The end. So that ends our story, our book, and our YouTube reading for 3rd grade. I love you all. I miss you already, and summer's just now starting. Have a great, wonderful summer. Promise me you will read every day. And I hope to see you soon. Good night.